Welcome to this chapter, or the start of this chapter. We'll be looking at the cell. And many of these things will be very familiar with you because you've seen them in previous courses, but it's worth walking through and talking about some of this. Now, when we're looking at the cell, we really can look at a number of features, and we can look at the anatomy of the cell, the organelles, and of course, there's a lot of things that happen within a cell. That we have cellular metabolism, that much of our metabolism actually happens at a cellular level. And so looking at cells and kind of understanding a bit of their functioning is an important feature. So cellular metabolism. Also transport of substances in and out of cells and between cells. And the tissue surrounding cells is also important. Communications. Cells do not live in isolation. They live in a community. And they're really the vast majority of cells are talking to each other. They're local neighbors, distant cells. So communications is an important bit. And cell reproduction. There are some cells in the body that you're basically born with all you're going to have of that type. But other cells in the body have to replicate on a regular basis. Red blood cells, the linings of the GI tract, the oral cavity, the respiratory tract, your skin, etc. So cell reproduction. Now, when we're talking about cell metabolism, this really is all the chemical reactions that occur to basically maintain life. And we certainly can break them down into the major groups, which we quickly looked at in terms of the chemistry chapter. We have anabolic reactions. They're building. They're about small molecules bonded together to form larger molecules. Catabolic are breaking down molecules into smaller molecules. And then, of course, there was the redox, and the redox are really tied in with storage and release of energy. And of course, the main unit of energy is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, of course, transport's important because things that a cell makes have to be transported either locally or quite a distance in some cases. Think about cells that are part of glands in the endocrine system, say up in the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Those chemicals may travel quite a bit of distance through the blood. And of course, communications, as I said earlier, are really important because the cells have to talk to each other. They have to coordinate what's happening. It's a lot of chit-chat between cells for them to figure out what they should be doing or not doing during that time, whether they should reproduce or not reproduce, etc. And of course, cell reproduction. It's cell division, and that is for both growth and development. So if we want to make the liver bigger, you can add more cells. Or in terms of development, think of going through embryonic and fetal development. You start off as one cell and you end up with this fabulous multicellular individual. And also the replacement of old and damaged cells. As I said, cells that line the GI tract, they get sloughed off. They get destroyed all the time. Same with cells that line the respiratory tract. So they have to be replaced because of just wear and tear. And of course, when we're looking at a cell, the overall structure has three main components. And of course, we can go into great detail about all these components. The plasma membrane. And think about the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is about separating the insides of the cell with the outside environment. And they are selectively permeable. So they really try to control what comes and goes from a cell. The cytoplasm is basically all the stuff within the cell membrane. That would be organelles and non-organelle materials. And of course, the nucleus within there. So as we talk about the plasma membrane surrounds each cell, and it basically separates, as I said, the internal from the external environment. It also provides a structural support. It gives a boundary to that cell. And there's a cytoskeleton actually within cells that we'll touch on a bit later that also helps to give it its shape and give it some of its sort of semi-rigid structure. The plasma membrane is also the way that cells can communicate with their surroundings and other cells. And a big component of that is cell identification. And we'll certainly talk about some of these things as we go through the course. Cell identification, of course, is very important in things like the immune system. Now, the plasma membrane also defines the intracellular space, I should say. And this is where I have the ICF, which stands for intracellular fluid. You can also call it the cytosol. That's another name for it. And of course, outside the cell is the extracellular fluid. Now, when I'm looking at the cytoplasm, we're sort of breaking things down into categories here. I have the cytosol, and what do I find in there? Mostly water, dissolved solutes, inclusions. These could be storage molecules that I'm storing in that cell. And depends on the type of cell. It could be glycogen, things like that, and proteins. And of course, within this fluid, this watery environment, this is where many important chemical reactions occur. Now, not surprising, we also have within the cytoplasm the organelles. And the organelles are really these sort of little specialized machines that carry out very specific functions. And we'll have a look at those. And they're suspended in the cytosol. And we have this concept of compartmentalization, is that one of the jobs of the organelles is to sort of be an organizing spot. It's where I can have special enzymes or special structures that allow for that organelle to do its very specific function. And this compartmentalization also ensures that the work that happens in that organelle will not affect the rest of the cell, because there could be enzymes inside that cell that are doing, inside that, I should say, organelle, enzymes within that organelle, which are really very important for that organelle to carry out its work. But if they weren't contained within that organelle, they could be quite destructive to the cell or the local tissues. So compartmentalization is important. And then there's this thing called the cytoskeleton. And it's actually a really very important part of a cell. And usually we're used to looking at cells, with a plasma membrane there and a nucleus and some organelles throughout it. But the one thing most books don't highlight is the network of this cytoskeleton that runs throughout the cell. So it's a network of protein filaments. It helps to give shape to the cell. It holds many of the organelles in place and actually provides transport for substances within the cell. Believe it or not, with some of these, here I'll just draw, one of the little filaments that's associated with the cytoskeleton. There are actual special proteins that sort of kind of walk. They're called motor proteins, and they actually use these cytoskeleton filaments to basically carry stuff along the cytoskeleton network. So they have a really big role in transport of substances. Now, most cells contain a nucleus. Remember I just said most cells, not all. Mature red blood cells get rid of their nucleus to make more room for hemoglobin, etc. Some cells have a number of nuclei because they were formed by fusion of precursor cells. But most cells contain a nucleus. And in many cases, it's sort of a spherical organelle. Now, in some cells, it takes on very special shapes, but in general, it tends to be a round type organelle. And it is enclosed by a phospholipid bilayer, very similar to what we'll talk about when we talk about the plasma membrane, and we call it the nuclear envelope. And this is where it contains most of the cell's DNA. And it's a primary location for making most of the RNA. And of course, DNA and RNA have a really big role in controlling organelle functions. Why? Because they code for and they produce or synthesize proteins. And of course, proteins can be structural, that they can give structure to a cell or to a tissue. But one of the big categories of proteins are enzymes. And of course, enzymes are a biological catalyst that is used for a number of reactions. So, just talk a little bit about cell size and diversity. It's easy to fall in the trap to think that all cells are kind of either square or round, and they're not. That cells do come in a wide variety of size and structure. And of course, remember, form and function go hand in hand. And let's just have a look at a red blood cell. A mature red blood cell, it's biconcave. It's concave on both sides. You notice this increases the surface area to allow for gas transport through that cell membrane. It's also a great shape because that type of shape allows you to travel through small blood vessels and capillaries without basically jamming up. And it also allows these red blood cells to be a little bit bendy McTwisty. They can actually twist to go through really tight spots. A neuron. Neurons come in many different shapes. We're used to seeing them look like this, but when we get to the nervous system, we'll see that there's a number of different, very distinct types of shapes for neurons. But of course, a neuron, most of you know, typically has a dendrite, cell bodies, and an elongated axon. By the way, these can be so very long. There are some neurons that are up to about 1 meter in length. So size varies quite a bit too. Epithelial cells, when we do histology, we'll talk about how epithelial cells really are jammed shoulder to shoulder. That's one of the features about them. And this shape goes well with its function. And of course, skeletal muscle cells are a very different type of shape. But the key message is that structure and function really can be seen in the various shapes of cells. Now, we're going to leave that little intro there. In the next video, we'll come back and we'll talk about the structure of the plasma membrane.